On October 8th, 1871, flames devoured the heart of Chicago, etching a tragic chapter in American history. But on that same fateful night, another inferno raged further north, consuming a small town in its fiery maw. This wasn't just any fire, it was the deadliest blaze in American history, yet its story remains largely untold. Hey there, history lovers, Mr. Mayflower here with another deep dive into a fascinating tale from our past. If you love history, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and now let's get into it. Nestled in a vast pine forest, Peshtigo, Wisconsin thrived as a bustling lumber town. But beneath its lively veneer, danger lurked. Weeks of drought had left the land parched, transforming the surrounding woods into a ticking time bomb waiting for a spark. And then, on the night of October 8th, 1871, that spark came. Now, the legend surrounding the Chicago fire involved Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern which started a fire in the heart of the city. But in Peshtigo, there was no dramatic singular event. In fact, the forests around Peshtigo had been smoldering since late summer. That year of 1871 had been exceptionally dry, and for the past 3 months, there had only been a single sprinkle of light rain. The land around Peshtigo was just waiting to erupt. Logging and railroad construction had cut down countless trees in the area, and they left behind mountains of highly flammable branches, leaves, and bark known as slash. On quiet evenings that October, people could hear the crackle of fire out in the forests. On dark night, they could see orange and red snakes of flame creeping along the ground out in the woods. In town, smoke and ash made breathing the air a real challenge. Out on the wood-planked streets, the sound of people coughing drowned out the whir of the town's sawmills. Nearby on Green Bay, the smoke was so thick that ship captains had to rely on navigational tools and use foghorns. They just couldn't see the lighthouses, let alone the harbors or the coastline. By that time, people in Peshtigo seemed to be almost nonchalant about the danger of fire. After all, they had survived many close calls already, fighting fires near and in towns several times over the previous weeks. And wildfires appear to have been a normal occurrence in the forests surrounding Peshtigo. So the forests were smoldering, and then a cold front moved in, and along with it came wind. What started as a whisper of smoke, a forgotten campfire perhaps, soon escalated into an inferno. Fanned by gale force winds, the fire morphed into a ravenous beast. It wasn't just a fire, it was a firestorm. A tornado of fire consuming everything in its path. Trees exploded in fiery bursts, embers rained down like burning meteors, and the wind howled like a banshee, carrying the inferno forward. It's estimated that this tornado of fire had wind speeds over 100 miles per hour and temperatures that exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The people of Peshtigo were used to fighting fires, but they had never seen anything like this. Panic gripped the town. People scrambled to escape the approaching inferno. Desperation etched on their faces. Mothers clutched their children, fathers gathered belongings, and the air thrummed with the frantic cries of people seeking refuge. Some folks took to hiding in root cellars, others climbed down their wells, but those hideouts tragically turned into tombs. Other people ran into fields or ran toward the river. One of those people was Reverend Peter Pernin, who wrote in his book, The Great Peshtigo Fire, an eyewitness account.
1,000 discordant, deafening noises rose on the air together. The neighing of horses, falling of chimneys, crashing of uprooted trees, roaring and whistling of the wind, crackling of fire as it ran with lightning-like rapidity from house to house.
Many people sought solace in the Peshtigo River, its cool waters offering a glimmer of hope. But even the river wasn't immune to the fire's fury.
When turning my gaze from the river, I chanced to look either to the right or left. Before me or upwards, I saw nothing but flames. Houses, trees, and the air itself were on fire. Above my head, as far as the eye could reach into space, alas, too brilliantly lighted, I saw nothing but immense volumes of flames.
The intense heat turned the water into a scalding cauldron. People had to constantly douse themselves to keep their flesh from scorching. An eyewitness recounted a man who discovered a baby with no parents in sight. In desperation, the man rushed to the river with the child, repeatedly submerging the baby to shield it from the flames. The man feared he'd kill the baby in doing so, or at least panic the poor child. Remarkably, the baby began holding its breath like an adult as it was plunged underwater. Miraculously, both the man and baby survived. As dawn broke the next day, survivors were met with a new set of terrifying challenges. Everyone who had survived had suffered burns to some degree, and these poor souls had lost everything. They were without food, water, supplies, or shelter for miles around. Many had lost the clothing off their backs to the flames. And now it was bitterly cold. The swift-moving cold front had caused temperatures to plunge below 50 degrees. Mind you, this was 1871. Cars wouldn't be invented for another 15 years. They couldn't just drive to another town to get help. And even if they could, there was nowhere to go. The fire had burned over 1 million acres of land. And besides, they couldn't leave until another grim task was complete. They needed to tend to the dead all around them. Over 2,000 lives were lost. That's more than double the toll of the Great Chicago Fire. These were friends, relatives, and family members. Groups of able-bodied men embarked on the solemn task of giving the deceased a dignified burial. They prepared communal graves, and you can only imagine the horror of the scene as they filled them. Burly, indomitable loggers were brought to their knees in tears, overwhelmed and simply unable to collect the body of another child. And the dying didn't stop after the fire went out. People died of their wounds for days afterwards. Burns can cause serious electrolyte imbalances in the body, which are life-threatening. Many of these destitute survivors had no food or clean water and were unable to replenish themselves. Other survivors died on the journey to nearby towns. For 2 full days, the fire raged, painting the sky with apocalyptic orange glow. When the flames finally subside, leaving behind a desolate landscape of blackened earth and smoldering embers, the devastation was incomprehensible. The towns of Peshtigo and northern Wisconsin needed help, but there was no direct way to telegraph the state capital of Madison, as many of the telegraph lines were destroyed in the fire. But finally, 3 days later, a message got through to the capital. Now, it just so happens that the governor and other state officials were in Chicago at this time. No doubt they were busy helping out down there, unaware that their own state was in flames. But back in Madison, the governor's wife, Frances Fairchild, took decisive action. She rerouted trains loaded with relief supplies for Chicago and sent them to northern Wisconsin instead. Once the full scale of the fire became known, Governor Fairchild organized the state's relief efforts. He quickly routed money from the state treasury to help his people, and he implored the federal government for help as well. That help came a couple weeks later on October 21st. In this sense, it's a touching story of how state, local, and federal government worked to help the people of northern Wisconsin. Even individuals around the country chipped in. School kids in New York and Pennsylvania collected clothing and supplies to send to Peshtigo. In Ohio, they held a charity concert to raise money for Wisconsin. And individuals around the nation sent what aid they could. Still, the devastation in Chicago overshadowed the tragedy in Peshtigo. Wisconsin businessman Joseph Harris complained that Chicago would receive millions of dollars, while Wisconsin would get only a couple $100,000. Chicago was just far bigger news, and people around the nation heard about the Great Chicago Fire first. Many folks said they'd wish they'd heard about Peshtigo sooner, as they had already donated all they could to Chicago. The History Channel recently ranked the Peshtigo Fire as the 4th deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history, and the deadliest wildfire. It was more disastrous than Hurricane Katrina, yet most people have never heard of it. I'm actually from Wisconsin, and I don't recall learning about Peshtigo in school. Overshadowed by the drama of Chicago's burning heart, the Peshtigo story has remained largely untold. Maybe it's because Peshtigo was a small town, its voice easily drowned out by the larger narrative representative of Chicago. Or maybe it's due to the lack of iconic visuals like the photographs and paintings of Chicago's scorched cityscape. Or maybe it's because Peshtigo just didn't have that mythical story like Mrs. O'Leary's cow in Chicago. Whatever the reason, forgetting Peshtigo does a disservice to the victims and their families. Peshtigo serves as a reminder of the importance of preparedness, environmental responsibility, and the enduring power of human resilience in the face of unimaginable tragedy. Thanks for diving deep into the tragic story of Peshtigo with me, Mr. Mayflower. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more fascinating stories from the history that we all share.